Hey folks, my name is Mo Amir and this is VANCOLOUR, British Columbia's bona fide culture and politics TV talk show. Ahead of Earth Day on April 22nd, it's all about the environment tonight. The trucker from Merritt, BC, who blew the lid off a potential government grant corruption scandal, will be here to talk about how American governors are courting his clean tech company to move down to their states. But first, how can we talk about the environment in this country without talking about the carbon tax? Our first guest tonight will unpack it for us, a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia with a focus on climate and energy policy and a member of the BC Climate Solutions Council and Canadian Climate Institute. She is Dr. Kathryn Harrison. Dr. Harrison, thanks so much for being here tonight.
I'm happy to be here.
So, simple question. Hopefully it's a simple answer. What is the carbon tax actually taxing?
It's taxing fossil fuels proportionate to how much carbon pollution they produce.
Okay. Now, most people feel the carbon tax when they fill up their tank at the gas station. So on a per liter basis, how much are British Columbians paying at the pump when it comes to the carbon tax?
17.6 cents.
Okay.
And that went up by 3.3 cents. On April 1st.
Okay. Now, we have our provincial carbon tax, which was actually instituted in 2008, but then there was a federal carbon tax that was brought in 2019. So I'm curious, is the tax rate is the same between the federal tax and the provincial tax? Is it applied to different things? What are the differences?
So the scope is exactly the same. Both the provincial one and the federal one have two parts, one for industry and one for households and small businesses. And in fact, the federal one was based on the scope of the BC carbon tax, which was there first. The price per ton of CO2 is also identical.
So you're paying the same at the gas station, whether it's the federal carbon tax or the provincial carbon tax?
Exactly.
Okay. Yep. Are there any differences then?
There are. The main differences between BC and the federal carbon tax, which applies in 8 other provinces, has to do with the rebates, what happens to the money after it is collected at the pump or on people's gas bills.
Who gets more of a rebate then, British Columbians or people who are paying the federal carbon tax?
People who are paying the federal carbon tax in most places. The BC carbon tax rebates are different in a few respects. Not all of the money is given back in rebates. About 2/3 of it is spent on climate action, things like subsidies for heat pumps and electric vehicles and about 40% of it on transit investment. So that's different. The federal government gives it all back. Not everybody gets a rebate. Everybody gets a rebate and the same rebate in federal tax provinces. In BC, it is only low and middle income households, and the amount is greater for lower income households than middle income, and then the wealthiest don't get a rebate.
When you say lower income households, that's in British Columbia, they get a bigger rebate?
Lower income households in British Columbia get a bigger rebate than middle income households. But the average household in BC compared to, say, Ontario, which is comparable in that there's very clean electricity, so people aren't paying as much carbon tax as they would be in Alberta. BC and Ontario, British Columbians, a family of 4 at $90,000 a year income would be paying about $400 more a year.
Federal or provincially?
Provincially, than they would federally.
Wow. Now, I'm seeing a lot of BC politicians talking about axing the tax. So can the province of British Columbia just get rid of its own carbon tax?
It can, but if so, the federal government would step in and apply the federal carbon tax. That's the way the federal legislation is written, that it establishes a consistent national benchmark. It's up to provinces if they want to do it themselves, but if they don't, the federal government will step in. The difference would be if there is a conservative government elected federally and they axe the tax as they have promised to do.
And I just want to reiterate, but if we were on the federal carbon tax, we would have more rebates then for more people and perhaps at a higher rate. Is that right?
Yeah, everybody would get rebates, which they don't in BC. And I think on average, most people would get more money back.
And so what I'm also hearing is that BC can't even lower its current carbon tax. It has to stay at that threshold that we have federally.
has to stay at that level.
Okay.
In fact, one of the things we learned when BC acted first in 2008 and no other provinces followed suit is that it was really challenging to be the only province that was taxing industry and business. And so BC froze its carbon tax until the federal government stepped in, and now we follow the national schedule.
Now, the big question, is there any evidence to show that the carbon tax is actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
There is.
Okay.
And a lot of it comes from British Columbia.
Oh, wow.
When BC adopted its carbon tax, it was this, brilliant situation for economists because we had one province with a carbon tax and a whole bunch of other provinces with consistent data without a carbon tax.
Right.
And so there have been, by my count, about 15 studies that found that BC's carbon tax lowered emissions below what they otherwise would have been. Didn't hurt the economy, was fair. But what we also know is that we can't get the kind of emissions reductions that we're committed to at $30 a ton. That's why we need that steadily increasing price schedule.
Right. Now, has the carbon tax actually made things more expensive? Because on its face, you look at it and you go, yeah, of course, the price of fuel is up, so the price of transportation is up. Has it really made everything from groceries to housing way more expensive?
Not way more expensive.
Okay.
So I'd say a yes and a no on that one. Yes, in the sense that if the products people are buying were produced using fossil fuels, that will increase the price of those products, as it should. It then gives people incentives to purchase products that are less carbon intensive. But even with the tax and the pass-through from other products, most households nationally are getting more money back in rebates than they are paying. So, yes, in that the prices of things go up a little bit. No, in the sense that most people are getting more money in their pockets that will help them afford those slightly higher prices.
I feel like it's almost a case of people just not recognizing that they're getting that rebate, right? I often hear from people who do get the rebate and they go, well, I never got mine.
There is a very high level of misunderstanding in provinces that are subject to the federal tax where everyone's getting a rebate. About 20% of households think that they are getting more money back than they're paying, when in fact the reality is 80%.
Interesting.
So part of the Axe the Tax campaign is to emphasize the costs and not talk about the rebates. And so people tend to forget that they're getting money back. They don't check if only one adult gets the money. Each household check with their spouse and say, did you get a deposit every 3 months? And so there's really a lot of misinformation, a lot of misunderstanding.
Dr. Harrison, thank you so much for unpacking the carbon tax and for explaining it a little more for us. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Folks, that was UBC's Dr. Kathryn Harrison. Now, after some business, he pulled back the curtain on government grants, which put a high-profile accounting firm in hot water, which prompted BC's Auditor General to investigate. But missing in this story are the incredible things that his clean tech company is accomplishing. I'll talk to Chase Barber of Edison Motors up next.